Okay, everybody. Now let's take a look at a few spatial relationships, and many of these items that I will present here overlap with your readings in Chapter 1, and I've also included in a few other special topics for us to look at. We'll take a look at some of the terminology and concepts in Introduction to Geography, Chapter 1. Okay, um, is Russia a neighbor country of the United States? Is the country of Russia uh, a neighbor? Does it border the United States? Well, you'd have to say no. It does not share a land border with the United States in the same way as Canada and Mexico do, but it does come pretty close. Here in this Siberian portion of the country of Russia is almost to the state of Alaska, separated by the Bering Straits there. So really it almost is, even though it's not a land border, certainly it's very close, and that part of our country very nearly borders Russia. However, we don't think about Russia as being a neighbor country of the United States. We think about Russia as being on the other side of the world, especially if you look at where the core areas of the two countries are, where most of the population is, most of the culture, and so forth. In the United States, located about here, whereas the core area of Russia, where most of the population isn't in this thinly populated area of Siberia that is near to Alaska. Most of the population is over here in the European part of Russia. So is it a neighbor country? Well, depends on how you look at things. And so this gets into ideas of location. We'll take a look at how important location is to geography. For any of you that are interested in getting rich in real estate, they always talk about the three most important factors that determine the value of any piece of property. Does anybody know what those three factors are? What's the most important factor that determines the value of a piece of property? Well, the most important factor is location. Okay, what's the second most important factor? Well, it's also location. And what about the third most important factor? It's location too. So they always say in real estate, it's location, location, location. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're stressing how important location is by repeating it? Or could it also be that there are different ways to look at location or define location in different contexts? And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at the distinction between absolute versus relative location. Those are two terms in Chapter 1. And how that also relates to the geographer's concepts of site versus situation. All right, let's take a look at example of that. Here's an example of the absolute location for the city of New Orleans. When we talk about absolute location, we mean the location of something on some type of grid system. In this case, it's the system of latitude and longitude. Now, we will be discussing latitude and longitude when we get into Chapter 2 about maps and cartography. But it's absolute location is a coordinate system where you can precisely locate any place. So for example, New Orleans is located at 29 degrees 57 minutes 15 seconds north and 90 degrees 4 minutes 30 seconds west. So that's its absolute location. The absolute location is kind of like my seating chart. See, on my seating chart, I know what student is located in row number 3, seat number 2, or in row number 4, seat number 5. All right, it's a grid system for locating places. Well, that's absolute location. Have a good location? Well, the site location is pretty terrible. In the long run, relative location is more important, and its relative location is fantastic. We can also talk about absolute and relative distance. Now, for example, if you were going to go with a friend to go see a movie and they didn't know anything about this area, and they said, well, let's see, there's not a movie theater in Pembroke, but there is one in Lumberton. So if they ask you, well, how far away is Lumberton from the UNCP campus? And you told them, oh, Lumberton, it's about 25 minutes away. Well, what does that mean? He was asking how far. That's a distance, right? That wouldn't he be looking for a unit of distance in miles? Well, that's not how we talk, though, sometimes about distance. Sometimes we talk about distance in not statute miles. For example, you say, well, it's 10 miles exactly from the Pembroke post office to the Lumberton downtown post office is a distance of 10 miles. We talk about distance in that if you get in a car and you drive 55 miles an hour, how long does it take you to get there? So in that respect, then Lumberton is located about 25 minutes away from the UNCP campus. You can also talk about distance in other relative ways too. Sometimes shipping. How much does it cost to get it there? Not so much what the aerial distance is, but how much does it take to get there? How much fuel must be expended to get it there? What are the delivery costs for that? So, like location, distance can also be absolute versus relative. Now here the map they have for the textbook looks at travel time going from San Diego to Solona Beach. How long does it take to get there? And so what these red lines show are isochrones. If you got in a car and went 55 miles an hour, how long does it take you to get this far away? Notice that when you cross over major highways here, the line kind of bends out because on the highway you can go further faster. All right, so that's a relative distance in driving minutes. Sometimes we use that. Okay, another concept, and we'll look at the concept of scale in a little bit more detail when we go into chapter 2. But for right now, the impact of scale on generalization. And a point that I'm trying to make here is, does truth depend on your scale of generalization? Can something be true at one scale and not be true at another scale? Well, yes, sometimes the scale of your generalization makes a difference. Let's take a look at this map from your textbook, and I'll pose this question. It's not a very exciting question, okay, but it's one that I think is fairly straightforward, and you could see an answer to it. All right, well, let's see. How about this question? Is Illinois densely populated? The state of Illinois, is it densely populated? That seems like that should be a pretty easy to answer question. It either is or it isn't, right? Well, let's take a look at these two inset maps that are on different scales. Now, here's the legend that shows what the population densities are on the map units. And you kind of have to visualize that. You know, how many people could fit on a square mile? Like say in this block here, this yellow block, if you can imagine looking down the road on a clear day, you might be able to see a mile down the road, and then look off to the side. You better hang on to the steering wheel though. Look over there, if you can see down a mile, and that's a square mile. How many people could live there? Or how many people are there? Are there 19? Are there 2,000? How many? All right, so now when you when you look at Illinois, okay, here on the map of the Midwestern states, all right, Illinois is in the highest category. So the answer to the question is Illinois densely populated? Yes. It's in the highest category of population density in the Midwestern states. But now take a look over here at the county map of Illinois. And now ask that question, is Illinois densely populated? Well, maybe your answer might be a little different there. Notice that while the area around Chicago, Cook County, adjacent counties where the cities are, they're densely populated, but most of Illinois is mapped out here 20 people or less per square mile. That's pretty sparsely populated. You know, most of Illinois is not densely populated, but the cities sure are. So that's, you know, most of Illinois is empty. A lot of it's farmland, but you know, you get a different answer if you look at a different scale. We'll come back to this topic about scale and generalization and what scale on a map does for you at a later time. Because the generalizations you could make at a local scale might be different than generalization you could make at the national scale, and different from the generalizations you might make at the global scale. So more on that at a different time. Now this next slide looks at spatial associations. I'll try not to say correlation because that gets into some complex subjects in statistics, but we'll say association. If you look at these two maps, do you see any correlation or association between the two variables? Let's see, in Texas, does the distribution of where Catholic and Lutheran religion dominates match up with those areas where alcoholic beverages may be purchased? Whereas the Baptist and Methodist areas, for the most part, were predominantly dry areas. Now let's see, in religion, is alcohol prohibited in religion? Well, it depends on which religion. Some in Christianity, well, in some parts of Christianity, Roman Catholics, wine is even used in ceremony. Whereas many Baptists and Methodists do not drink alcohol, or do not drink as much alcohol. So that's an example of a spatial association. Very often, one cultural characteristic has an influence or even controls another cultural characteristics, and these can be shown on maps. All right, that's a fun one to look at. How would you vote? Would you vote yourself dry? Okay. One of the other magic words that we'll look at in this class, and particularly when we get to the chapter on cultural geography, is the word diffusion. Diffusion is just another way of saying the movement of phenomena, say the spread of a disease or the migration of a people and so forth. And so here, this shows the diffusion pattern of the world's three major religions: Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. All right, from their origin or core areas, spreading out and colonizing and mingling with other peoples. A couple of other spatial concepts, and we look at this more so in Chapter 7, is the idea of spatial interaction and connectivity, in that different places are connected to each other, and if they are, then they have more spatial interaction. One of the more important basic topics in geography is the concept of a region. Let's see, we break the world up into regions to make it more understandable. It's often said that the region is to the geographer what the time period is to the historian. In history class, you study what happens in different time periods. So if there were no time, or if there was no difference over time, there'd be no reason to take a history class. Well, similarly in geography, if everywhere was all the same, if there was no regional differentiation, there wouldn't be any reason to take a geography class. So it's one way that we organize the world according to selected criteria, and thus we know about the differences from place to place, and thus understand them more fully. Certainly mapping out regions is an important part of spatial analysis, something we've discussed already. And that if you have data, map it out. What does it show you? By mapping out regions of your phenomena, shows the location of them, their areal extent, and maybe some other underlying characteristics as well. There are different kinds of regions. Your textbook looks at the distinction between administrative and formal and functional regions. Administrative regions are regions that are created by our laws, and so we have a line on the map. There doesn't have to necessarily be a line out actually in the physical environment. In a lot of places there is. There's a border, or there's a line between countries. So the country borders are an example of an administrative region. And then the state boundaries, well, they're administrative regions. And then the counties, the zip codes, the school districts, the congressional districts, and so forth. They're all administrative regions. Now, in your textbook, they talk about the term formal region. And here, this is more of an invented term. 5 years after the class is over, you probably won't remember too much about formal regions. Sometimes there's another term that's used, uniform regions or homogeneous regions, and that, all right, for one or more characteristics, show the distribution of that. For example, here, we can take a look at this agricultural region of Australia map. And so let's see this, the extensive cattle grazing region is shown in kind of this light yellow color. Okay, and that's distinct from the sugarcane growing region or the extensive sheep grazing region and so forth. So logically, it's uniform for that characteristic, and that where you have more than 50% of the land use is cattle grazing, or where that's the dominant one, then you would map it out that way. They're a formal region. Sometimes regions just function as regions. For example, these newspaper distribution marketing areas are functional regions. They're not a region that's officially in law, and they're not homogeneous, but they function as an organized unit. They often have central controlling nodes or centers, and sometimes they're even termed nodal regions. There's a lot of back and forth in introductory geography of arguing over what's a formal region and what's a functional region. And probably 5 years from now, you're not going to remember the distinction or the definition of formal versus functional regions. But how you conceptualize about space and how you talk about area is important. So I'm going to share with you one example of how I remembered when I was taking this class long, long ago, the distinction between formal versus functional region. Does it function as a region, or is it a homogeneous region? Okay, here you have these cultural regions, agricultural regions, and you have the individual farmsteads here. Here you have the farmsteads. This must be in some area of French Canada or maybe Louisiana, where you have the farm houses lined up on the road or the river, and the individual farmsteads are in a long lot back from the road or the river up to the ridge crest. And so that's equitable because everybody has kind of the same type of land. And everybody has a little bit of flat land, everybody has a little bit of slope land for the vineyards, everybody has a little bit of rugged upland area that could be used for pasture, and also some upland forest area for firewood and so forth. Well, let's see. The formal regions, or the homogeneous regions, would be, well, this is the wheat growing region. This is the vineyard grape growing region. This is the pasture region. This is the forest region. Okay, those fit the definition of what a formal region is. Now, the functional region, they're organized regions, and so that would be the property that's owned by the one farmer. Okay, it's not homogeneous within it. It's organized to be a region, and its node would be the farmstead. So it functions as a region. Okay, if Farmer Smith's farm is a region, but it's not a formal region, it's a functional region. Okay, we'll take a look at this later in the course too. Another type of region in cultural geography too is what's called a vernacular region or popular region, in that where there's the mental image of a place, and everyone can agree that that area is a region, but there may be little agreement as to where exactly it is. For example, the Midwest in the United States. All Americans can agree that there is a Midwest, but people that live in Kansas, they don't consider people from Ohio to be Midwesterners. You could study this, I suppose, by various types of surveys and so on. Who is a Midwesterner? Now, this comes up sometimes, because especially during election year, where you may be wondering, well, how is such a candidate doing in the Midwest? You know, the middle of the country, the normal American values and so forth, the American average, is that the Midwest? So it's more of a perceptual region as opposed to a geographic location region. Let's take a look at some other examples here. This is from Wilbur Zielinski's book, North America's Popular Regions. Now, there is a place called the South, and that's distinct from New England. It's distinct from the Midwest area. Yeah, there's this region known as the South. In the United States, when you talk about the South, you're mainly talking about the southeastern quarter of the United States. Now, when you say the South, it's not so directional, is it? And where is the South? Well, that's part of the United States that, let's see, that lines up historically with the pre-Civil War states, the antebellum South. Other parts of the United States are just as far to the south as, say, Georgia is, but we don't consider them to be part of the South. And if you're in Seattle, Washington, and you're talking to a friend and you tell them, well, I'm from the South, they know where you're from. You're from this area, the southeastern United States. If you told them, I'm from the South, they would say, oh, San Diego, is that right? No, that's not the South. So when you say the South, that's part of our vernacular, popular speaking. All right, so here in this survey, you kind of get who's a Southerner here in the brighter red area, where 90% of the population considers their area to be the South, whereas maybe 10% might consider New Mexico to be part of the South. Is West Virginia part of the South? Well, it's kind of a gray area, actually, a red or pink area in this case here. So it's what's known as a vernacular region. An important part of cultural geography is studying the cultural landscapes. All the forms and artifacts put on the physical landscape by the activities of man. This can be things like architectural types, land use patterns, and so forth. Even the religious structures, iconography, and so forth, all say something about the culture. And geographers can read the cultural landscapes and know the history, know some subtleties that are going on there. So more on this when we get to chapter 6. Speaking of cultural landscapes and lines and so forth, can you tell where the border line is between the United States and Mexico from this satellite image? Well, you can, and we will look at this concept later when we get into cartography. But here, what this is a false color satellite imagery. It's a false color satellite image where what you see is green on this map isn't really green in reality. What you see is red on this map isn't really red in reality. It's actually green. What this is this is by using reflected sunlight, but only looking in the infrared band, and that our special satellites are able to pick up where the most vegetative zones are by looking in the infrared, and then it's color coded in such a way to show that. Well, one of the things you can see the border here, and there it is between the United States and Mexico. On the U.S. side, there's a lot more irrigated agriculture, and on the Mexican side, there's much less of that irrigated agriculture. And cultural landscapes continually change. This is a photo directly from the textbook that looks at Dubai in the United Arab Emirates and how much their landscape has changed due to the oil boom. It was a backwards fishing village, coastal area, and now an ultra modern city, tremendously wealthy. Now, here's a special topic, and usually what I would do on the first day of class in the face-to-face classes is spread out some of these maps and then ask them a simple question. And for example here, what factors explain the distribution of wheat production? And you'd be thinking like a geographer if you could come up with an answer. Most people usually put down the physical things. Well, it's more of a middle latitude type crop, but what explains the major areas and the minor areas? In the United States, you have the major areas that are in the Great Plains areas, which is a semi-arid environment. Wheat would actually grow better in a more humid area, but the most valuable land in the United States that there is used to grow corn to fatten livestock with, and so wheat being a lower value crop is grown in the more marginal lands to the west. So there are a lot of other factors that go into the distribution of any phenomenon. In this case, an agricultural type. How about cultural preferences? There is in Mexico, is the population prefer the Amerindian population prefer breads made out of corn as opposed to breads made out of wheat. Is there an economic incentive? Is there a subsidy for the crop as well? Okay, but we won't do that in class. Something else, also looking at things spatially, is this an example of bad cartography? Well, you have your good cartography and you have your bad cartography, and you know it when you see it. All right, well, something like this, and this is the type of thing. It bothers me. It probably doesn't bother you, but it's the type of thing that bothers me is sometimes how mapped information is misinterpreted. So, for example, here, wine production in 1999. All right, so you have 21 years since then. Okay, well, that's appropriate, I suppose. 21 years ago, and they're producing wine. So this is the wine-producing countries. But here, there's a couple things that I'd like you to consider. This is the total production. So it's not scaled to per person or per capita. It's just the amount of production. Well, the odds are, if you're a big country, you're going to produce a lot of wine just because you're a big country, as opposed to if you're a small country, you're not going to produce as much. There is some environmental aspect to it, and that those areas in the middle latitudes, those areas that have a Mediterranean climate are big producers around the Mediterranean. Here in Europe and in South America, Argentina and Chile are parts of that, and even Australia. You think of them as being beer drinkers, but they also produce a lot of the world's wine. The Republic of South Africa as well. It's right in the zone. It's a very good grape growing environment, produces a lot of the world's wine. But here's one of the things that a lot of times people misunderstand when looking at map data. How about Alaska? Does Alaska produce a lot of wine? Well, they're the highest category, right? But the thing is, though, this is mapped out by country, So you have to put the entire United States in there. So here, sometimes people get the idea, wow, they must be producing a lot of wine in Alaska, and such is not the case. All right, it probably would have been better if, at least if this was going to be a country by country map, to put in the wine production or the wine consumption on a per capita basis. Okay, in the United States, you could break it up by state and do it on a per capita basis. Or perhaps some type of dot density, where one dot on the map equals so many tons of wine produced, and then you see the distribution of dots. Well, there you're not only thinking like a geographer, but you're also thinking like a cartographer as well, which is the subject that we are going to take up next, which is Chapter 2, all about maps and cartography and some of the geographic techniques. All right, that's it for Chapter 1.